Welcome, everyone. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I would like to recognize that the IRPP's offices, where I am speaking from, are located on the unceded traditional lands of the Ganyankahaga Nation, whose members we recognize as custodians of these lands since time immemorial. This area has long been a gathering place for many Indigenous peoples. We honor their enduring connection to this land. The IRPP's Community Transformations Project is aimed at supporting and empowering communities and people as they navigate a period of significant economic change. Indigenous communities could be disproportionately affected by economic disruption, given that they tend to be rural or remote, have pre-existing challenges, and may be closely linked to resource industries. The IRPP is working to mobilize the knowledge, experiences, and voices of Indigenous peoples as part of our research. Before we dive into the panel discussion, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Ricardo Chejfec, who is going to highlight some of the data analysis he has done exploring the susceptibility of communities to net zero transition and tariffs. Ricardo is a research director at the IRPP, leading our Empowering Canada's Workforce program. After Ricardo finishes, we will have a panel discussion until 2 p.m., and then we will open things up to audience questions. Over to you, Ricardo.
Thanks, Rachel. It's great to be here. I'm going to spend the next few minutes giving you a very quick tour of the data analysis we've been building over the last 2 years. Goal here is just to set the stage, to give you a bit of context for the discussion we're about to have, which I'm quite excited for. Oh, there we go. Some context. This project started really by looking at global decarbonization. We knew that the shift was coming and that it would disproportionately affect specific regions. But as we did this work, the world kept changing. We are now seeing trade realignment, specifically through tariffs and supply chain shifts, and the rapid adoption of AI layering on top of the energy transition. Some of these forces might balance each other out, but more often they will compound. And that creates a complex landscape of risk and opportunity that we need to navigate carefully. One problem is that we typically measure economic health at the national or provincial level, but averages hide a lot of detail. Issues like this might call for a much more localized approach instead, for a number of different reasons. One is concentration. A large shock in a small town is barely seen in national data, but could have long-lasting impacts locally, especially if the local economy significantly relies on the affected industries, leading to ripple effects. The second one's geography. Many of the industries powering our economy, energy, mining, agriculture, are located in rural and remote areas, and are also some of the industries most likely to be impacted. All of this is also part of why we should all care. On top of the fact that our fellow Canadians want to live there, the viability of these communities is key to Canadian sovereignty, economic resilience, and social cohesion. Ultimately, we know that local communities hold the blueprint for their own transformation. The key here is finding the right way to empower them, to support them. So how did we tackle this? We started by building a methodology to identify which communities are most susceptible. But the available data has some limitations and can really only point you in the right direction. So we paired this analysis with more qualitative insights through a number of community profiles that were informed by visiting these communities and interviewing local stakeholders. All of this analysis is feeding into our policy briefs, which offer more concrete recommendations. You can find all of this, the interactive maps, the dashboards, the briefs, commentaries, recordings, and more on our website right now, with more coming in the following months. But I promised some data, if I can get the presentation to work. So here's how we applied that framework to the net zero transition. As you can see, we break down susceptibility down into 3 more specific types of risk. The first one is intensity susceptibility in blue, which looks at communities that rely on employment in emissions-intensive industries, like manufacturing and trucking. The second one is facility susceptibility in yellow and orange, and in the light blue in one case there. And this one looks at places that have a large industrial emitters relative to their size, often from heavy industry. Our last indicator is market susceptibility, that looks at communities that rely on industries where global demand is shifting, like oil and gas or auto manufacturing. When we isolate all of the communities that score high on either of these three metrics, we find that they are, on average, smaller, more remote, and less economically diversified than the rest of Canada. But at the same time, we find that these same communities are split on other demographic and economic indicators of risk and resilience. All of this reinforces the idea that we need to look at communities specifically to find the right solution mix. But the real test to this framework came earlier this year when the US imposed new tariffs. We realized that the risks were quite similar, so we adapted our methodology. Instead of emissions, we measured exposure to US exports, or how much local employment relies on selling goods across the border. The map that you're seeing highlights that result, a belt of small, relatively small manufacturing communities near the border that are highly sensitive to trade disruptions. But crucially, this approach was useful even when we didn't know exactly which products would be tariffed. For the same reasons, it can be a useful tool in long-term planning or when dealing with lots of uncertainty. In fact, we heard from municipal governments who used this data to help build a case for early support during the summer. This brings me to some of our more recent work. Unlike the two previous maps, which look at long-term structural shifts, this analysis is about more immediate trade friction. This is why we built a model that uses both effective tariff rates and historical export data, looking at tariffs not only from the US, but also from China and India as the situation has developed. And I have some early results in this figure. If you look at the scatter plot, for example, where every dot is a community or a census division, the y-axis will tell you the share of the local workforce that is at risk. The higher the dot, the more that specific community depends on products exported. The x-axis shows the total size of the workforce. And what you can see is this cluster of communities in the top left. Small, less diversified communities where a big portion of the town's livelihood is tied to tariff products. But I'd also encourage you to look at the size of the bubbles, which represents the raw number of workers at risk. You can see that there are large bubbles even further down the chart. This tells us that susceptibility isn't just a rural issue. Cities face that risk too, but because they are more diversified, their relative shock is dampened. Those affected still need support, but the policy solutions, the timing, the urgency, their shape, might look different than it does in a more remote town. A small disclaimer here is that this is provisional data. We are still very much crunching the numbers and refining the specific tariff lines, so please treat this as work in progress and keep your eyes open for this come the new year. And just to wrap up, so we can get into the interesting discussion, this has been really a very brief snapshot of what we've done so far. The obvious next step for us is to see where these different maps overlap, so we can understand what makes these places similar or different and what the right mix of solutions we should be thinking about. But even before we get there, the data is already telling us some great stories. To give you some examples, we already know that Indigenous people make up a larger share of the workforce in susceptible communities. We know that growth and innovation supports are rarely or almost never concentrated within these susceptible communities. And we know that most of the susceptible communities rely on a single industry for a big chunk of their employment. This is only a taste. There is so much more to explore on the website, so I invite you to scan the QR code or use the link after this event to learn more. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Ricardo. That's really excellent foundation for our panel discussion. And we are really fortunate today to have three amazing panelists with us to talk about community resilience. We have Troy Dungate, who is the president of the Communities Futures Network of Canada, which is a federally funded nonprofit community economic development network with 267 offices in rural and remote communities from coast to coast to coast. Troy is a practicing lawyer based in northern British Columbia, Prince of George, I believe. Gordon Moore is the executive director of the Southeast Techhub in Estevan, Saskatchewan, and a leading voice on rural innovation in Canada. Gord has experience across the innovation spectrum, having founded a multinational software company and now leading a rural incubator aimed at advancing clean energy, technology innovation, and economic growth. Tamara Krawchenko is an associate professor in public administration at the University of Victoria and a visiting scholar at the IRPP. Her research covers comparative public policy, regional development, and sustainability transitions. She is the research area lead for policy and planning with the Accelerating Community Energy Transformation Initiative and serves as chair of the UVic Local Governance Hub. Thank you so much to you for being with us today.
Thanks,
So
Rachel.
I'm going to jump right into our first theme, which is to talk about some of the challenges that communities are facing. Ricardo gave us a good overview of the data, but I want to hear more about what communities are facing from people who are on the ground and researching these challenges in depth. So Troy, let's start with you. You have an incredible network of people working with small businesses in communities across Canada. What are some of the challenges rural businesses face in the current environment of trade disruption and uncertainty? And I'm particularly thinking in your neck of the woods with forestry as well.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for inviting me here. I'm proud to represent my network of 267 offices across rural and remote Canada. So rural entrepreneurs in Canada are operating in a context where every form of uncertainty is amplified. So we have supply chains that are fragile, input and transportation costs are incredibly volatile, and interest rates have risen, even though we've seen them come down a little bit. After a long period of cheap capital, interest rates are still higher than potentially what a small to medium-sized business could feel comfortable in. So for a small firm in a remote community, these swings can erase already thin margins very, very quickly. So then you add in the trade disruptions, just a whole nother layer. So many rural businesses are part of a longer value chains, and that connect into the US and beyond. And even if they do not see themselves as exporters, when the tariffs shift, when border processes change, or large buyers adjust sourcing strategies, the shock is felt downstream in the form of canceled orders, price pressures, or delayed payments, kind of thing. So then further to add, capacity is a big differentiator. Larger firms located in urban markets, they have teams to manage risk, diversity markets, and navigate the new rules that come up. But a typical rural entrepreneur is doing sales in the morning, payroll at lunch, delivers in the afternoon. So ask them to go track a global trade dynamic and redesign their business model is a pretty tall order to get them to do, kind of thing. And then we've got those labor and demographic shifts that are occurring. All the things that Ricardo was highlighting. The result is really a hesitation to invest. So we see entrepreneurs on the ground deferring growth, avoiding possibly equipment upgrades, postponing succession. Transition plans are just unsure. So the rules of the game are going to be different. Rather than just in 3 to 5 years, this is a much shorter time frame. So if this persists, it's pretty tough. So resilience is a big risk for rural Canada, and which is why it's exciting to be here today to discuss this with all of you and highlight these things.
Right, thanks. Tamara, you've done a lot of work on the potential local implications of the net zero transition. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges communities face as the world moves toward more electrified transportation and clean energy?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. It's a great question. And what I find in a lot of my work is that I'm looking at what net zero means when it lands in really specific places. And so I'm always looking at place-based dynamics, but I do see some big interrelated challenges. And the first one is that a lot of local grids and planning systems simply weren't built for the scale and speed of electrification that's on the table right now. And for the last year with the team, we've been holding dialogues across northern BC on community energy through the Accelerating Community Energy Transformation Initiative. And we're hearing a lot of concerns about grid reliability, lack of energy diversity, long lead times for even pretty modest distribution upgrades, as people are looking at things like EV fleets and heat pumps and new industry connections and stuff like that. And these are places that are already living with, wildfire risks growing and flooding and frequent outages. So more electrification kind of can sound really risky unless it comes with some serious investment in resilient, community appropriate infrastructure. And there's a lot of interest, but it needs proof of concept. So that's one thing. And then second, I see that there's a real risk of uneven benefits and harms across regions and different social groups in my work. And that's something that I really appreciate about the IRPP's Community Transformation Project. I mean, they're highlighting that. And so for rural and remote Canada, there's this kind of oversized challenge. There's rural regions of Canada are responsible for a little over 50% of emissions, and they're around 20% of the population. And the reason for that is the types of industries that are there. And so there's a lot of risk, and rural regions often have less economic diversity, weaker fiscal capacity to manage shocks. So that that raises the need for really proactive place-based regional development. And I really appreciate, again, how IRPP has been championing this approach and tells the story of places like Estevan. Those case studies that you all did were great. And a related final challenge, I'd just say, is this governance and capacity gap. So Canada's net zero and clean electricity ambitions, of course, rely heavily on businesses like Troy mentioned, on municipalities, on Indigenous governments, on regional organizations to do all this hard work to align land use and housing and transit and charging infrastructure and local energy projects. It's a lot of work. And yet what we see in our conversations across northern BC is that there's often really thin local staff capacity to do this important work, pretty fragmented funding programs, and consultation fatigue as well, even where there's a lot of interest in things like energy sovereignty and learning from each other. So bridging this gap through longer term flexible funding, stronger multi-level coordination, genuine co-governance, and that sort of thing will be really important. And I just briefly, to end, just want to say I'm focusing here on the challenges, but there are so many opportunities, and we have to really highlight those because there's a lot of great work. And that the same projects that electrify transport and expand clean energy can anchor new local industries, do community-owned generation, energy efficiency programs, keep more wealth in the region, improve health and air quality, and I could go on and on. So this can really help move us from an extractive economy, this staples economy, this staples trap that has always been this kind of development conundrum for Canada, to one that invests in regional development and actually delivers good community well-being.
Yeah, it's such an important point. I mean, when we talk about community transformations, it's not all negative. Sometimes it's big projects, big investments coming, and how do we manage that at the local level as well? So it's thinking about both sides. Gord, I want to turn to you. Estevan in Southeast Saskatchewan, which I've had the pleasure of visiting twice, and I'm hoping to come back, although maybe not in a snowstorm. Estevan is on the front lines of some of the changes that we're talking about. At one point, when I first went there, the coal plants and the coal mine were closing. But now I understand the Saskatchewan government's plan is to keep the coal going until 2050 while transitioning to nuclear energy. So I want to hear your perspective on what have all these ups and downs looked like for the community, and how are people feeling about the new plan?
Yeah, definitely. I'll get into that. But thank you for having me on, and thank you for coming out here and coming into our community and taking a time, because you came and talked with me, you came and talked with municipal leaders, business leaders, and people. And the story that you've asked me to share with you just now with that question, I mean, it's a story of we need more people to come into these rural communities and talk. The blunt reality is, however you're watching this, however you're listening to this, 99% chance that the electrons that are powering this conversation is coming from a rural community. So the story that you've asked me to tell with that question is something that I think is affecting all of rural Canada. And so how does it feel? Like, how does it feel to have your community about to disappear, right? And it's coming from people who've made a decision without ever visiting you. And so how we got here was to this change is the provincial government here in Saskatchewan, both at the elected level the deputy minister and assistant deputy minister down, spent a significant amount of time coming into our community and talking with all of us and hearing how it will impact, what we will need. But the other side is also hearing a perspective that they might not hear, which is the technical. Like, how do we take a community, how do we take a province that's minus 40 for 4 or 5 months of the year and then suddenly switch within by 2035 when the technology just isn't there just yet? And the other thing is, like, the provincial government, they provided our community with a coal transition fund, and in 2024, last year, after talking with us, realized that we need more funding to continue off the transition. The federal government's last funding ended with our community March of 2024, before the reannouncement of the coal continuing. And when you look at about the amount of money the federal government has given to rural communities for transitioning, and you compare it to places like Germany or Australia, we're talking pennies on the dollar. And so it's been left to provincial governments and municipal governments. I had one person say, well, why doesn't a government person say, well, why doesn't the city just fund this transition? And I'm like, we're 10,000 people. How big is our tax base? So why that decision was coming, and I know it was controversial from other people, but it's realistic of where the technology is right now. And it also gave our community a chance to just breathe for a sec. Like, the province has said we are going to go to nuclear. For Saskatchewan, it makes a lot of sense because the supply chain for nuclear is in Saskatchewan, from mining the uranium, hopefully all the way through and up, and we're working on that. So there is this chance, but it also gives the community a chance to reskill, to think things through and how to move on. Like, when they first said that, like 2-3 years ago, people had houses that they didn't know how to sell, right? And now we're, with all this new energy coming in, like energy and energy coming in, it's a whole new thing. The other neat thing is, as we talk about this more further on, it's given people such as me with our work, it's given us time. And when we come in and say we want to diversify the economy through technology and innovation, some people chose to make us bad, put us in the bad pile. Because of X, Y, Z, and we purposely, and we have, these are political decisions, not ours. So it's allowed that conversation to change. So we can just talk about how innovation and technology can help transition or make a community more resilient. I like that last bit better than transition.
Well, that's a great segue to the next segment that we're going to talk about, which is the positive side of things. What does community resilience look like? So, Tamara, I want to start with you. Is there a definition of community resilience? What do researchers think about it?
Yeah, as you can imagine, they have a debate and they define it in different ways. But basically, in a nutshell, in simple terms, it's about a community's ability to prepare for risks, withstand shocks, adapt to changing conditions, and recover in ways that maintain or improve well-being. And we study this, but I think what Gord's remarks were really highlighting is this is about how people live in their communities and the future of their communities. Like, the stakes are huge. So you can make it an academic concept and use those terms, but we always have to think, what does really well-being mean? And we know people are attached to place, and so how can we make sure that they are indeed resilient in their communities? And so in the literature, resilience is, and I think this is right, it's not this fixed state. It's a really dynamic process. People talk about, for instance, bouncing forward rather than just bouncing back after a disturbance or a transition of some kind. So instead of asking necessarily whether a place is resilient or not, it's really about evolving capacities that help navigate shocks and stresses, and that's a really living thing. And so when I use that term, I'm usually thinking about the whole bundle of social, economic, institution, and I have to stress cultural capacities that allow communities not only to cope with disruption, but to steer toward a desired future rather than being pushed by these events. And I really do think the cultural elements are critical. So we're going to talk a bit about government funding, but honoring the memory of a place and the legacy of industry while you think of a new economy is part of resilience. And I've seen great examples of that in Western Australia and coal communities, how they really, really honored memory. Anyway, so all of that I would say is where academics come from.
So, Gord, given that, what do you think would make Estevan and Southeast Saskatchewan more resilient to possible economic shocks?
Can we extend the conversation by a couple hours? But within a few minutes, like diversification means, let's get to the core of it, which is coming up with new ways, new industry, new ways of creating money, wealth, and what have you. And taking advantage, like Tamara was mentioning, like these challenges are great opportunities. That's my attitude in life, right? And like the challenge of new energy changes in the world is a great opportunity for Estevan. So give people an idea of what we have here. So yeah, we have oil and gas and we have coal. But if you system neutral think, that's a way of innovating something new. Coal, it contains energy. It's just how do we get that energy out in a way that's clean but yet cheap? So we are doing things like turning our coal to hydrogen with the CO2 being used for batteries, fertilizer, going underground for enhanced oil recovery. We're turning our coal to graphite for EV batteries. Like these aren't, and when I see these things, we're like well into engineering of these things, right? But the other thing is in rural Canada, you just got to get it done. And when you translate that, you just said innovation. So if something breaks in a rural community, or you have a challenge that you need to overcome to get something, some process, some system working again, you have to innovate. You can't just jump in your car, drive 20 minutes and go to Best Buy. You got to solve that problem yourself. And it's always been like that. If you go back further into when the Indigenous community was the only community here, ask yourself, how did they survive for 4 or 5 months of the year at minus 40? They were very innovative. This is a very innovative space. And so we need help to make us more resilient. We need help to incubate these rural innovation ideas. The last thing I would say about all of this to help make rural Canada more resilient is innovation, disruption. It's driving the world right now. Like, and not just on the technology and industry side. Donald Trump became president because of disruption created by Elon. I'm not being political. If I'm just saying straight there, that is how much disruption and innovation and all that stuff is happening. So we have this group of people that in our country that are just innovative by nature. We need to empower them to not just diversify their local communities, but diversify our whole country's economy.
Troy, we often, when we hear about resilience, a lot of people think about the major employers, the big companies, but they don't talk about small businesses a lot. So what role do small businesses play in helping to build community resilience?
Awesome question, and I think that this is a key educational piece for Canada, because in rural and remote Canada, small businesses are not just the private sector; they're the core infrastructure of daily life. They provide essential services, quality jobs, and are the only local points of access for everything from groceries to trades to professional services. So when they are resilient, people have a reason to stay, to return, and to bring their families. So from that resilience lens, a diverse ecosystem of small businesses spreads that risk out that Tamara was talking about. So in a community depends on, if they only depend on one large employer, a single closure is devastating through the chain. When there's a mix of small firms across sectors, from tourism, manufacturing, natural resources, the digital economy, shocks are absorbed more evenly, recovery paths open up more quickly. So thriving small businesses underpin basically the social fabric. Owners are the people chairing the local chamber of commerce, sponsoring the hockey game, sitting on the hospital boards and municipal councils, and mentoring that next generation of entrepreneurs. So, add into that civic leadership is critical when communities need to mobilize quickly in the face of disruption, and the civic leadership, can be made up of the small entrepreneurs. And our experience at Community Futures is that when you intentionally nurture the ecosystem, through financing, coaching, creating basically a strong fabric and a diverse fabric, you're not just helping individual businesses, you're building that muscle, communities to adapt, pivot, and seize new opportunities over time. Pretty much what Tamara was laying out for resilience.
So let's turn to what governments can do to help communities build resilience. And why don't we start at the federal level? So we just had a federal budget, and there have been several announcements about major projects. So Gord, what's your take on is the federal government on the right track? Or will these announcements about major projects and trade infrastructure help rural communities? And what do you think is missing?
Thank you. It's to be positive. If you take a look at a map of all the of where all these projects are happening, they're all in rural Canada once again, and it makes sense. So that is brilliant. And to my first question about the story of Estevan and that being across Canada, this is going to help address a lot of those concerns. So that is really, really good. But there's a true story that I want to tell you guys is that with the nuclear reactors that we are most likely getting, Saskatoon, so Sask Poly, without ever talking to any community in the Southeast, just decided to announce that the nuclear training will happen, like to run the control room, will happen in Saskatoon. And I don't mean to pick on them, and we're dealing with it, and that's fine. But it's just a kind of a cultural example of what happens in Canada, where so much of the education of things for these kind of things happen in urban settings. And if you're listening to me and you're in a city right now, just think of it this way: if you're going to build these projects, unless we build the capacity for skills in rural communities, your tax dollars are going to have to go up because you're going to have to pay to bring all these people from urban places where you've already trained people to come to Estevan or any of these rural communities. You're going to have to buy a hotel or a hostel or a building for them to all stay. You're going to have to pay for hospitals and doctors and policing and all those things. So it's cheaper. It's just cheaper to put long term to bring this education into rural communities. And the other thing about all of this is trades is huge. Like if my children were asking me what they should get into, I was like, be a plumber, you make more money than a lawyer. Everyone knows that joke, and it's true. But on the other side of the coin is that the rural urban divide is such that a lot of these higher educated jobs aren't no longer happening in rural, and we need to bring those back. So I guess what we can do is turn this around into a positive. This is if the federal government wants to achieve its goals, this is a great opportunity to take money and say this money should only go to build capacity in rural communities.
So I just want to situate some people who aren't from Saskatchewan here. So how far a drive is it from Estevan to Saskatoon? I know you do that drive all the time.
I do. I could save money just getting an apartment there. It is about 4.5, 5 hours, depending on the weather. So that decision would have meant if you are, and we have kids here in our high school that are thinking about working in a nuclear power plant, which is extremely rare. So we're asking them, or one of these existing coworkers who now want to work in a nuclear plant, we're asking them to commute 10 hours a day. Or we're asking them their family to spend a bunch of money that they may not have to rent an apartment and feed them and house them and not have family support, mom, dad, grandma, uncle, brother, to support them through all their studies, just leaving in an urban setting all by themselves. And there's been lots of studies, Hinkley C and Sitewell in UK, when they built those nuclear reactors, they started going that way and putting that training in Manchester. And it was such a financial failure, they ended up building the new training facilities on the construction site.
Yeah. Troy, we were really excited when we heard about the announcement of a $100 million partnership between BDC and Community Futures to support rural entrepreneurship. Can you tell us about that a little bit more and how it might help build resilience?
Sure, and I think I'd shine some light on the work that IRPP did. basically BDC has to go through a legislative review every 10 years, and the work that your organization has done shine the light on this missing link of what's available for rural and remote entrepreneurs. And what we can see across Canada is banks are retreating off the playing field of helping small and medium-sized businesses. They kind of figure it's too expensive to operate in that field, and they aren't deploying the same number of small business bankers as they were. So through your guys' work highlighting entrepreneurs are in obviously rural and remote or cities, the BDC stepped in and said, how can we access another 100,000 entrepreneurs in the next 5 to 10 years, kind of thing. And IRPP's work highlighted the Community Futures organization of having 267 offices located on the ground in rural remote communities. So pretty exciting to pair that together. And what that means basically is we get to leverage BDC's balance sheet and our Community Futures local presence, so that entrepreneurs can access, financing and advisory services where they live, and not hours away in larger centers back at, other banks, kind of thing. So it's going to close some gaps. It's pretty exciting to be able to leverage what we can to do it, and hopefully it's not just 100 million from BDC and 100 million from Community Futures. It's going to be a decade full of refunding that. So from a real resilience perspective, this is a pretty powerful partnership. You're seeing the Government of Canada direct one of its crown corporations or arms to help in rural and remote Canada, and you're seeing the Community Futures, which is funded by the federal government, stepping in to partner and do it. And I think the fun part of it is it's the first step of recognizing like a federal focus or federal policy that needs to come in and focus on rural delivery as a specialized skill. So that's really, what more is needed is just and I think, Gordon, you were really talking about it, and I saw you get almost a little bit tear up, is we've got a lot of government saying in big centers what to do and what happens in rural Canada, but they're missing coming here and doing it, kind of thing. So really the next step is this federal focus and policy needs to be honed on rural delivery. And I think that's where IRPP is really shining the light. It's a specialized skill. So it's IRPP is focused Community Futures as a partner to deliver that last mile partner, building us into the design of programs that basically can deliver it on the ground. So pretty exciting time. And I really appreciate IRPP's highlight of the Community Futures program. That's basically what got us there with BDC. So thank you.
Great to hear. And, so many people aren't aware that Community Futures is, federally funded organizations on the ground in and around rural communities in Canada. And it's one of the only things the federal government has in those places quite often. So it's to us, it's just an opportunity to, as you said, have that effective implementation on the ground.
It's exciting. Like, just to add to it, it's an exciting part of the government took a risk to let the citizens in each of the communities run the Community Futures offices. So their local boards deployed to solve local problems, kind of thing. So it's such a unique thing. And I don't know if the government would do that again right at this point, but I think through our PP highlighting what you do, there's a chance that they're going to really focus on that in the future. So thank you.
Could I just jump in for a sec?
Yeah.
Troy, that was a great comment about risk. I think if you want to actually de-risk and you want to get solutions that actually become something, become jobs, become wealth, become industry, then you work with the people on the ground in the community. So I hope they continue, because it actually de-risks that whole spend.
That's great to hear. Tamara, you've looked internationally at policies used to support regional development, and I want to get a sense from you, how do you think Canada compares? And are there things the federal government could do, for example, as part of the Sustainable Jobs Action Plan or other policies that could build on the experiences of other countries?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm always trying to figure out, and I'm always trying to understand what even is regional development in Canada, really. So yes, we have a regional development architecture, and we have federal regional development agencies, and they work with the provinces and territories. We have our incredible Community Futures organizations. We have the federally funded Indigenous financial institutions, which are absolutely successful, have, given out many times successful loans and have a great repayment system. So these are all part of regional development, and regional development is this like big mix of institutions, and all of those institutions are super critical in rural, remote, and Indigenous Canada. And I always think, well, how do we compare and what are we doing? And I think we have a lot of differentiation across Canada in regional development, so it's hard to say even what it is. But then on the flip side of that, we have all of these kind of innovations, like different places doing different things, regional development in a different way, which is also great because you have experimentation. A few things that I would note from kind of the international work I do is that in all of the transitions management, work, that successful transitions, they really generally are proactive and territorial. So you invest early, you look at the infrastructure in the regions that's going to be affected. You don't wait for a crisis, and you actually need the analytics to understand what's happening in sub-regional economies to do that. And I don't know in Canada that we necessarily have those analytics. And I ask governments often. I'll give a few examples in a bit, but that approach to strategic management is grounded in understanding of what's happening in places, and we don't even have sub-regional GDP data outside of metropolitan places in Canada. So how do you understand what's happening in communities? And I think community futures programs and organizations like that have a better handle on that, and that we should be engaging them to understand. The second is to align skills and training systems with regional development strategies so that workers can actually move into new opportunities being created, which is what Gord was raising. And where are those regional development strategies? How do we scale and do regional ECDEV in rural and remote territories? That cannot be a community by community thing. And so one thing I really see in Canada is we have too much of a competitiveness model with our programs, and we really need to have rural, urban, rural, Indigenous, or you get the point, partnerships. And that doesn't come from nowhere. You have to invest in that and design programs that deliver on that. And the third is to empower local Indigenous institutions, to co-design and govern transition strategies. So I think that type of partnership model, we just don't necessarily have it. It happens when there's a lot of goodwill and leadership, but it'll happen way more if it's funded. And then for the Sustainable Jobs Act and its action plans, yes, this is a great opportunity to bring all of these lessons home. The federal government could hardwire place-based approaches into the action plans by creating stronger regional transition tables with more municipal particular leadership there, or community leadership and Indigenous leadership. It was to some extent, but largely what I'm seeing at those tables is that they represent specific sectoral interests and a lot of incumbent industries. And I think they kind of missed some of the point on territorial development and the role of those tables on territorial development. I don't see them as a regional economic development strategy, not in places. And alongside that, predictable multi-year funding so communities can really plan. And finally, I think to do all of this well, to even understand what's happening in different economies, particularly rural and remote economies, we need to have better regional data and evaluation to be able to understand things and scale up promising models. So I think this was a recommendation made by the IRPP, and when they presented their advice on the Sustainable Jobs Action Plans, it's recommendations that I made as well, echoing that we really need community-led, data-driven, place-based approach, and we need the analytics and the type of work that Ricardo just presented to do that type of work well.
Yeah, and I want to underscore something you said too about being the proactive part of it, because as you know, so many programs are just built around reacting, or it's an ad hoc sort of reactive response when an impact happens in a community or something, as opposed to, we know the communities that are susceptible, and especially when we know major projects are going, there's so much potential for having more of a proactive approach to make it work for the community.
Yeah, I'll say one other thing about that, and Gord brought this up too, pre-investment in the community. The community needs funding for investment and capacity to leverage in a potential new industry or these mega projects that are being announced and so on. I have so many examples of this from visiting different places, but one place I was in Northern Ontario, there was a mine expansion. The community just couldn't get it together to zone the land effectively and create new housing, despite the fact that the mine owners wanted to have people living in place, which was something the community very much wanted too. And just because of a lack of capacity, a lack of pre-investment, they couldn't get it together and they ended up going with work camps, which bring a number of problems, social problems, and so on. So, there has to be some pre-investment community benefit when there are major industries coming in. It just makes sense to plan well for that, and it leads to much better community outcomes long term.
Well, let's turn a little to focus on the provincial and territorial role here too, because provinces and territories play a big role in local and community development. They tend to lead on regional economic development. They fund colleges and universities. They have a lead role in energy policy. They control planning, infrastructure, revenue generation, all of those things. So, Troy, how do community futures organizations work with provinces and territories and provincially funded organizations such as local colleges? Is there a lot of coordination at the local level?
Yeah, so the community futures mandate that the federal government gives us is to basically be that unique role of trying to create solutions from the community, basically, and that's why the local board is so important, and even the staff and the team that work at the community futures office to figure out what those are. But so the community futures are going to sit at a unique junction between federal programming, provincial and local priorities. So on the ground, they're going to collaborate with provincial ministries, regional development agencies, publicly funded colleges, universities, anybody in the community that's interested in getting together to try and figure out and solve a problem. So they'll be hosting the meetings and trying to facilitate the discussion and create a strategic plan. So aligning training, business supports, anything like that is how in depth and on the ground community futures organizations can get. So when the coordination is strong, we're co-designing programs with colleges, entrepreneurial boot camps if we can, sector specific training, all sorts of different levels. And the fun part about when a community gets around to solve a problem, the creative solutions are amazing, right? And then I think that's the super focus of what we know will make a resilient community is the solutions come from the community themselves, kind of thing. But at the same time, if coordination isn't there, and it's uneven, it's not as fun and it's not as helpful, kind of thing. So where that can occur is if different levels of government are hesitant to cooperate they're more territorial or whatever, right? So, I mean, we need to almost get past this. I'm federal, I'm provincial, I'm municipal, I'm this, and I only deal in these sectors and I only help these specific individuals, kind of thing. And we need to come together as true Canadians as we have been and revitalize ourselves as like, I don't care if you're fed, I don't care if you're a province, I don't care if you're this. Let's get together and solve this and remove the almost legislative barriers that are there to do it, kind of thing. So it can be better across the country if we can have that team approach and just, hey, I don't care if that's a federal requirement or a provincial requirement or municipal requirement. So, but ultimately, and I'll say this to everybody on the call on this webinar right now, you turn to your community futures office and see, if you can insert that problem in them and see if they can generate, a facilitated meeting to solve the solution and see what they can do, kind of thing. Because that's what we're supposed to. We're on the ground ally to try and help you solve problems and try and remove these separate silos that are hindering our communities from advancing and being resilient.
Oh, I love that idea. Tamara, what are some of the key differences that you've seen in how provinces and territories support community resilience? Are there any provincial or territorial programs or policies that you think could or should be replicated across the country?
Yeah, I'm always looking for good examples, and it's when I find them, I don't necessarily have the evaluation to show the success. It's just like this is a way of doing things, and it seems like a good thing. And so IRPP's Abigail just mentioned one to me that I started looking into, which is the federal RDA, the Canada Economic Development for Quebec Regions RDA, have this targeted support for Quebec's economically vulnerable regions and communities initiative and municipalities. And so basically they're using an economic development index to identify different vulnerable regional county municipalities that then they offer more flexible conditions and higher cost share support to help them do entrepreneurship or reindustrialization or things like that and services. So That's very interesting to me because what I find is that in Canada, we don't typically identify places that are lagging or not doing well. So in a European context, they have, they have a lagging regions initiative for regional development. They say these regions aren't doing well and they need our support and we need to have targeted investments for them. Or also, they have the just transition mechanism where they identify comprehensively which regions are transitioning to design targeted proactive supports. So, naming these things, I mean, that's what I'm raising in this example. They're naming it, they're saying that these are economically vulnerable areas and we need to do targeted things to support them. I find we don't do that, and we should. I think that's very much a leading example. A broader thing is just how we stitch everything together towards a comprehensive, coherent regional transition strategy. And so international experience shows that it should be really integrated with regional development, where you have skills policy and social supports and everything under a transparent framework. And Spain's just transitions agreements are really interesting that way because it's an agreement between the national government with labor unions and municipalities and everyone coming together. And it's really backed by predictable funding. So that's a good example. And I don't have too many examples across Canada that do anything like that. But I think it's worth mentioning. And another one is perhaps the fact that transitions units. So BC has a transitions unit. It tends to be reactive when an industry is closing, but it's within the provincial government in BC, and they kind of work across government to coordinate services and get that community all the supports they need. And that seems like a great idea. It'd be wonderful if they had the capability to use different analytics to be more proactive and design different types of programs. Um, I always want to plug, as we've been talking, investing in these critical intermediaries like community futures and the Indigenous economic development bodies. That's great. That's necessary. And as a big picture view, a couple of years ago, I looked at all provincial and territorial strategies, policies, and programs across a huge range of sectors in Canada just to see how they considered rural, remote, and Indigenous communities explicitly. And what we found is that mostly they don't. So a place-based element is missing in a lot of our provincial territorial policy. So if across 331 strategies, plans, and programs, fewer than 1 in 5 explicitly considered rural or remote communities or Indigenous economies. And that's not good. We need to rectify that. And there were some bright spots. The Northwest Territories and other Northern Territories, as you can imagine, because of who they are, had the most integrated frameworks where rural, remote, Indigenous realities were really woven throughout all of the strategies that linked to economic development. I found that really interesting. And so I thought maybe we could look north for some inspiration on some of these things as well.
Absolutely. And Gord, you're living this effort to break down silos across all these different arms. So I want to hear from you as to how do you think these organizations could work better together?
Yeah, for sure. I just want to also jump on what Troy was saying. And I made the same recommendation when you came out and talked to us, and I was happy to see it in your report. But Community Futures is a great place to start. So our local Community Futures, Community Future Sunrise, run by Andrea Brady, they already, like, we don't have a proper RDA here, but she and her group are doing a wonderful group job, and we're starting to have regional, so the whole Southeast meetings together and talking more about what we could do. But from what I understand, they have not received any operational funding increase. And I know I sound like a broken record, but man, it's just the story of rural. I think Community Futures is really well placed in rural communities to bring these groups together. And a lot of us have, like, I have a high regard and high respect for Andrea and her group, as do most of the Southeast. So that it's a great place to start. But to your question, how to say this? So, you said my background. So I created a software company 20 years ago now, and I know what it's like to be an innovator. And part of being coming up with a new innovation, and the Southeast Tech Hub being Canada's only truly rural tech hub, which is not just an incubator, it's a whole bunch of other things, is it's innovative. And so I know from my past experience when we came out with one of the first ways to GPS track a phone, we were dismissed, right? So when you come up with a new idea, part of the innovation cycle is when you come up with a new idea, you're going to be dismissed. So, and then if you add that on to like, hi, I'm little Gord from rural Estevan, right? It's really hard. You're constantly that dismissiveness is amplified. So I think the first thing that to get everyone to work together is let's get over this Canadian culture. And don't forget, like I did live for a while in Vancouver, born and raised there. So this whole experience has let me see both worlds. And Gord from Vancouver was dismissive of rural. And so I know we are. And the other side of the coin, when I'm trying to like get groups of people together, that's one of the challenges. So let's get rid of that culture somehow, some way. On the ground lived experience, University of Regina, we signed an MOU with them to build the Innovation Center for Energy Development. They came to us and they said, we really like what you're doing. We want to help you. Like, how awesome is that? But usually when I go to other post-secondary, it's a bit of a challenge. Though there is one exception. Dr. Eric Grimston, the academic chancellor from MIT, is from here, and he jumped on a plane and came out and visited our community, and we do talk to him about certain things. So I guess it's like this weird bipolar, sorry to say it, but like experience. Like some way it's really good, and some way it's a challenge. Provincially, it's good. I wouldn't be here talking to you right now if we didn't receive the Coal Transition Fund from the provincial government. That's how I'm funded. Federally, it's just not there. Like the people on the ground at Prairies Canada, the National Research Council, Natural Resources, they're there. They're awesome. Great champions doing their best to tell our story. I was able, long story short, to have a good meeting with Jonathan Wilkinson. He's from where I used to be in North Vancouver, but he's also a Saskatchewan boy, so he was great. But to get an opportunity to talk, and I've been trying really hard at the federal cabinet level to let them know, like, here's the Southeast Techhub for all of Southeast Saskatchewan coming up with this wonderful solution. Help us out. And like, we're doing this on 260,000 a year. Like our whole operational budget is less than some of these urban tech centers, their executive directors' wages. Like we're lean, we're agile, we're getting it done. So like we've got so many solutions. Come and talk to us, federal government, and those people that you have on the ground in Saskatchewan. Listen to the story they're telling you because it's true. Another good way they can help us out is SaskPower did come in and become our title sponsor. The money is wonderful, but there's something else that does, is when I go out to industry, because at the end of the day, it's about bringing industry in and creating jobs or helping my local companies that I'm incubating, getting that connected. So when it's no longer little old Gord from Estevan with his cool idea, it's little old Gord powered by SaskPower, a Crown corporation, which is a Crown utility. I am now validated. So one thing that the different government levels can do is just validate us, not just so much with the money, but just by allowing us to say that your logos are on our thing. I'm allowed to say you're validating us, you're bought into the idea, you see a thing that can really, really help.
That's great. And, so important for, as you said, you're breaking ground on rural innovation and really highlighting a potential model for other communities across Canada.
Yeah.
So we're going to have one last very quick round of questions, but I want to signal to our audience that we're going to be turning to questions pretty soon. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom to put your questions in. Et n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions en français aussi. Nous pourrons les traduire pour nos intervenants. So we're just going to finish up with a very quick round on more looking at the local level actions that small cities, towns, and Indigenous communities can take, particularly when they have limited capacity. So Tamara, let's go to you. What do you think that a small town or Indigenous community facing potential disruption could do to help support their resilience?
Yeah, it's really tough question. And Gord, you just demonstrated a convening function of coming together and telling your story, right? And the vision. And so I think as a first point, it's like recognizing what's happening, understanding what's happening, making a plan, having a vision, thinking about what assets you have and what your potential future is and articulating that to each other and to others. I think that's a community-led process. And that can help you really identify risks and understand what's happening. And there are cases like in Cornwall and Ontario, so they deliberately repositioned themselves as a logistics and distribution hub after the pulp and paper mill closed, or small communities in BC like Valemount and Quesnel that created their own development corporations and started investing in pursuing kind of smaller employers rather than a bigger industry. So there's lots of different examples, and the levers often are planning, zoning, local investment tools, partnerships, and so on. And the big issue though is, what can communities do? Well, what is the governance and economic capacity? Um, Interestingly, I think there are so many great, innovative Indigenous examples of matching these efforts with community values. So there's so many here, well, and across Canada, of using clean energy as a lever for development. Hydro projects like Pick River First Nation, for example. Um, these aren't just technical projects, they generate own source revenues, they build local expertise. So there's a lot of kind of that is a really interesting potential future. And again, this can all be inspiring, but it takes capacity and resources. And I think that the real answer is that in some places it's just not possible. They're just communities, some places are dealing with multiple crises, opioid crises. We often don't talk about it, but in some rural places, there are many unhoused and like very, very serious challenges, like big city challenges that smaller administrations are trying to deal with. Alongside if there's a big economic shock. And in that case, you cannot expect a community to have the capacity to manage these processes, and there has to be an intervention and support. And I don't know that we're prepared necessarily. Upper level governments are really prepared for that, because so often the response has kind of been to really just sort of maybe hope people move away, actually, and sort of withdraw, kind of retract services and start withdrawing support and not really talk about it as an intention, but it is intentional. So I think part of the answer to that question is also sometimes communities, there's nothing they can do, and they really need support.
Yeah, that's a great point. Gord, how are communities in Southeast Saskatchewan planning for the eventual transition away from coal and toward nuclear? And how important is it to have sort of that bottom-up, community-led planning versus having a top-down approach?
Yeah, and part of your first question for this theme was about Indigenous, and it helps us. I'm learning. I've learned a lot in the last 2 or 3 months in just working closely with our Indigenous community to answer that question, and had an opportunity to hear the Meadow Lake tribal chief speak about their experience, and he was saying how they turned their challenges into opportunities. He was saying that they haven't received any government subsidy or sponsorship or in like 15, 20 years, because they've generated their own wealth through what they already had, and they now have their own corporation. And I'm like, man, you are 20 years ahead. That is the vision I've had with what I want to achieve with this, is that I hate going out to government and asking for money, man. Like, if we can self-fund and have our own fund, like that is amazing. So to that point, like this coal to hydrogen project that we're doing, which then is certified in the United States under GREET as clean, and we're working on our Canadian carbon one. It's owned by our local First Nations here, Ocean Man, like 100%. So um, that is just a great opportunity. But how do we? I'm I'm starting. I have a hard time with that word transition. It is loaded, but there's a truth to that loadedness. It's like, how are we continuing on with this process of change that we've been on for 150 years? And by giving us some of that funding that we did receive from the provincial government, we were able to chase down and do applied research on turning coal to graphite, right? That it will be clean. It will be cleaner graphite than mine graphite or synthetic graphite, right? It will be the only source of, one of the only sources, one of two in all of North America for graphite. Probably people hear that a lot for different projects, but because we already have this mine, because we already have our environmental permits for the mine and all this other stuff, we're going to pilot next year, right? So this is something that will happen, but that came because we were thinking about, okay, here's an opportunity we have to jump on to make that change. The other part is just being a part of the nuclear supply chain. Like, I was on a panel discussion at the Canadian Nuclear Association conference in Saskatchewan, and from that I learned something really interesting, which is there's no such thing as a nuclear electrician. There's an electrician that's had 6 weeks of training, and it goes with all the trades, right? So how can we bring in more of these types of training to take our existing skill set and just add that extra bit in? The other one is, like, again, on the nuclear thing, is that our oil and gas manufacturing group that is already in place for building pipes and what have you, they're 99% of the way there to build for nuclear. They just, again, they need the certification, and they don't really have to. They can just work with someone else that already has. Another example, again, I'll stop after this one, is that, like, the Arizona lithium and the lithium play that we have here, when you pump up oil from underground, you get a lot of brine. That brine has a lot of lithium in it, and where has some of the highest concentration of lithium in our space. So Arizona Lithium and another organization are taking existing oil and gas workers using that same technology and training they have, and now they're doing lithium. The next question would be that I think all of Canada has to face is that we've got to stop taking stuff out of the ground, putting out on a train and waving goodbye to jobs. And so what we're trying to do to help us with transition is, how do we keep some of that stuff here? So we've been working with the Battery Metals Association of Canada and have almost completed the Saskatchewan battery cluster. And in that, we're going to do a midstream battery processing plant in Estevan for lithium and graphite. I could go on, but there's the core is, if you work with, if you empower us to come up with our own ideas, it's in our best interest. Trust us, we want to make our communities more resilient. Just help us out.
Yeah, and I think empowering people like you, Gord, is really important too. And when I spoke with other people in Estevan, they described you as a godsend to the community. So I think
Don't do that. Don't do that.
So Troy, last word to you before we go to audience questions. What do you think that communities could do to take charge of their future?
Sure, and I'll do a quick job trying to summarize all of the brilliance of Tamara, Gord, and Rachel here. And I think, like, it should summarize everything that everyone's talked about, and that's start with locally led asset-based planning that identifies a few clear shared priorities, and don't chase every funding program that's out there, right? It doesn't make sense. You want to start with your own community, what you have in front of you. And you heard that from Gord. He's got 15 different ideas from, the one asset sitting in the ground there, and how that can be used to accelerate his community. I invite you to use the Community Futures office locally as a neutral convener. Bring everybody together, the municipalities, Indigenous governments, businesses, youth, community groups, all together at one table, and work together. Turn visions into projects. So don't forget about visions such as business succession and retention of those businesses. So when people retire, and the business doesn't just end, kind of thing, that you actually have a plan in place. Things like supporting new entrepreneurs in emerging sectors, joint initiatives, joint ventures with respect to tourism routes, shared facilities, community invest funds. I mean, you taking the control locally and making this happen is super, super fun stuff. Even if I can give a great example, in Prince George, back when we needed a pool in the 60s, it was every citizen putting $1,000 in as a bond to build that pool, and not waiting for the federal government or the provincial government to come up with returning tax dollars to the community. So you guys yourself can chime in, and the local businesses will really get behind it, kind of thing. Invest in local leadership capacity, and think around the future leaders that are around the table: youth, women, newcomers, indigenous entrepreneurs. All these people can start businesses and just may not know and need that ignition to do it. And then the next layer is they all serve on boards, and we need them to lead the community and the nonprofits and all the local organizations. So they're your future board members too. Don't forget about engaging all levels of government, senior levels of government, industry partners. Don't just view them as funders, but bring them in as helpful people at the table, and they may be able to go back and come up with solutions from what they're doing. So yeah, and just move away from the community-minded thing of program takers into co-designers of your future, kind of thing. So that's really where the sexy work of us as saving our communities can be, is you're going to generate your own solutions to the problems, but you're going to be the engine room. Cancel the Netflix and the Prime Video, get off those streaming services, get back in there and have some fun solving problems together.
Well, that's a great way to wrap it up before so I'm going to ask my colleagues Abigail and Ricardo to come back on screen. And I'm hoping Abigail has some questions for us from the audience.
Yeah, so we have a couple, and I encourage anyone who's on the call to feel free to pop your questions into the chat. We have a couple to get us started. So the first here is about the role of getting citizens ready for change. So, does this require educational campaigns? Does it require more work around building trust and sharing and mutual aid and communication in communities? So wondering what your guys' thoughts are on the role of that process in getting ready for communities.
Tamara, why don't we start with you as to what you think?
Yeah, I think that is critical, and I've seen different models. And for instance, here's one example. The Alberta Labor Union went around, I think it was last year. They did a kind of a tour of different communities in Alberta that they have faced a lot of change. I mean, there's been huge labor shedding, so-called, in the oil and gas sector in the last several years. And they had an opportunity just to have community members kind of reflect on how hard this has been and perhaps mourn together, really, and really face this reality of what they're already seeing, they're already experiencing. And so those were like town halls, kind of, but led by the labor union. So that's one example. And I've seen a lot of different examples at different places. So again, that social role of honoring what was while considering what can be is absolutely critical. It's cultural work. Sometimes it brings in and convenes the arts community. And it also, I think, should be intergenerational. And I don't know that we've always done a good job of that. It has to also engage all generations, both those who are retired, but also the young people who are future leaders. And you need resources to do that work as well.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I don't love the term. It's often used in Europe, and brown jobs and green jobs, and it makes it sound like it's good and bad. And really, it's just change, incorporating change into all types of work. And Gord, you have a unique perspective on that too, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So one of my values as a person is I believe like everyone is good. Like everyone's coming, maybe Putin, but like in general, everyone is good, right? And at the end of the day, what do people want? They want a roof over their head. They want food on the table. They want a happy life. They want a happy children, right? And if you come from that place and you talk with people and you allow people to hold on to the pride that they deserve to have, you come from a different angle, and the conversation can't be advertisement from a Toronto-based company or think tank or what have you. Sorry, gotta be careful because I really like the IRPP. But imagine you guys putting out advertisement. Hey, Estevan, change is good. Like, it's not going to work. And I'm sorry to pick on the questioner. I'm just trying to help out. So one of the things that I did is like if you come from that place, you quickly understand that the reason why there's pushback, the reason why you see misinformation, the reason why you see such a high level of conspiracy theories in rural Canada is because those things that I just talked about are being completely and utterly and totally ignored. So what we did is, okay, you are coming from a place because you're worried about automation. Automation is going to hit trade first. So what are we doing? We're building a 3-foot high humanoid robot with a community. We're about 2 years into it, right? And that's the high school kids, the college kids, adults, 65-year-old guys coming in who are old machinists coming in, and now we're at a point we just plugged in an AI processor into its brain. And so we're doing that together. But the point is, instead of having those people in the community having someone else explain to them on Facebook, what they should think, they're learning their own opinions by getting hands-on. Another good example is drones, right? In rural communities, there's goes a black drone over my head. It's the UN world, whatever. So we have a drone racing club. And what I really appreciated about it, because I'm a drone pilot myself with my RPass, is like in BC, if you're flying your drone, you're like, oh my God, someone's going to come and yell at me. We're here, it's like the municipality's like, here's some money, go create a drone club. And when I went back and told people, they were like, that's amazing. But again, give people the drone so that they can learn, they can fly. But then the final thing, which I mentioned before, there's no such thing as a nuclear electrician. There's an electrician that has 6 weeks, 8 weeks of training to be in radiation. Oh, by the way, did you know that the guy walking around with the Geiger counter, he's a trade? Like having that kind of conversation, and it comes back. I'm talking with people about the continuous progression of change that we've been on for the last 150 years. Like Estevan wouldn't have existed if they had not invented the steam train, right? This is just the continuation of everything that's going on. Yeah, if you come from that place, is like, you're good. You're totally right, and you deserve to be proud of who you are, your community. You can get those changes where the continuation of change happening.
And Troy, one of the things that we heard, which is why we recommended using community futures organizations, is that message of change and discussion of change comes best from people who know the community, who live in the community. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like local problems solved by local solutions is essential. Nothing worse than trying to get someone from another place to tell you how to solve your problem. You just won't even get the buy-in, right? This piece on education to me is so important, and even just talking about where Canada thrives from, where does it go? We need to do a better job teaching our youth. Basically 98% of employer businesses in Canada are small businesses. And people don't recognize that, and even just we have I think it's a B Corp recognition, but we maybe need a Canada Corp recognition to sort of say that at a certain threshold, 80% of this business is buying all Canadian products and using all Canadian and keeping everything Canadian kind of thing, so that people can actively choose. And I know Canadians will choose to pay a premium to make sure a Canadian business survives, kind of thing. So for me, the education piece that has been mentioned by the questioner it carries over everywhere. And Gord's covered it, and Tamara is in the throes of being in the education industry, right? So it's so very important to get Canadians back to the basics of how we're thriving and why we're thriving and where we need to go.
Right. Abigail, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. So one of the participants has asked, and this is the framing here. So they said, does the proposed Ottawa-Alberta Grand Bargain to be announced tomorrow change the game in terms of the pressure to adapt to climate change? It appears to shift responsibility from emissions limits to carbon capture, but does that affect how communities react?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is anyone in a position to talk about this yet? I haven't. We've all been on this and haven't seen the announcement.
I think this is about the pipeline, right?
Yeah.
Certainly changes, certainly northern BC and those communities for which the export is presumed in one of the most dangerous channels they have opinions. Yeah. I think BC has opinions about protecting their coastline.
I have this really weird one with this, right? So my dad was born in New Hazelton and he lived in Ocean Falls, right? And here I am in Saskatchewan in the oil and gas country. And I hear both sides, and there's a valid side to both. So I'm not going to really get into it, except for just saying the rural community in northern BC has something to say. The rural community in Saskatchewan and Alberta has something to say. They're both valid. My only concern is the federal government came into Estevan and said, you're no longer burning coal. Isn't that the same thing as going to Kitimat and New Hazelton and Prince George and saying, we're going to have oil tankers go through the Hecate Strait, the third most dangerous body of water in the world, or fourth? Talk to your real communities.
Yeah, Tamara and I had the privilege of being in Kitimat Village and meeting with the Haisla Nation earlier this year, and definitely heard their perspectives and concerns about a potential spill that could really just devastate the whole area and many communities.
Yeah. And they're really building very alternative economies there as well. Like around Prince Rupert, there's marine economies that are critical, and there's an idea of new economies around things like seaweed export and so on, and all of that doesn't gel with yeah. There's different visions, right, of the future.
Troy, what about you? You're right up there in Prince
Yeah,
George.
well, yeah, I love it and breathe it. And even the polarization of us as Canadians, I think, is such a unique thing. We actually cooperate a lot more. We're a lot nicer than we might think. And I think the media pushes us into you can only be in this box and you can only be in this box. And I think if you put us all in a room and you said, here's the solutions that we can come up with rather than this grand overarching, okay, all of a sudden now we're going to turn on the taps or not, right? I think there's even an education of what are they really talking about or not, and I don't think anyone would have the perfect answer here. So we get right back to the education piece, but also as Canadians, we can cooperate on a higher level for sure. We just remove I think the bipolarization of the media and see where we get.
Hallelujah.
Absolutely. Abigail, is there another question?
There is another. And this participant is wondering if the panelists can speak to the process of gaining community buy-in and what that looks like. And if you guys have maybe some examples of what that might look like.
Yeah, I'm curious to think about what the process should be in terms of getting community buy-in on any of these major changes, and whether it's a major project coming in or it's the closure of a facility either because of government policy or because of market change. What does that process look like? Who wants to take that? Troy?
I'll start. Start with a coffee chat and see where you go. I think what we're seeing across Canada right now is we're all holding town halls on crime, and those are really intense. But it doesn't have to be that hard, and it doesn't have to be that intense. You can simply say, here's a bulletin board. I'm putting up a sheet, and I'd like to talk about this at my local coffee shop. Who wants to join me? And honestly, you'll just see it snowball. But then the other part is a more formalized approach is approaching organizations like Community Futures, saying, hey, can you hold the conversation, or your local chamber of commerce, or any organization that might have facilitated meetings in the past. But it's as simple as inviting people into the conversation and see where they go. This venue right now that we're all on as a webinar hosted by IRPP is exactly that. We are addressing this issue across Canada and how we could all cooperate together. And I think I know I can feel the cooperation here across us and where this is going to go. So this is a great little example of how to start the conversation and get it rolling.
Yeah, I would add the just transition framework, which reminds us that we need to think about who benefits and who loses in justice in the design of all these mechanisms. And there's different forms of that. So there's distributive, like who bears the costs, who gets the benefits, like jobs and revenue and so on. The procedural justice, which is who has a voice. And that's what it means. Like that's really important when you're talking about convening people at a community scale. Where is information coming from? Who's recognized and respected actually in that process? That's recognitional justice. And then finally, restorative or reparative, so how you repair past and ongoing harm. And some of the models that are useful there are depends on the nature of the transition, but to have a central hub where whoever is represented, industry, maybe it's the federal government, provincial governments, just to like a physical space in the community that's like, this is this hub of recognizing that there's a major transition and where we have convening and support and accountable people that are not distant, but are actually the face of that in the community. I think that's a really good practice.
I want to reframe the question. It's not like how do you come into a community and get them to have buy-in? What is the community already bought into, and what are their ideas? And the overall arching part of this, when we had our provincial election in Saskatchewan, we had an all candidates meeting here in Estevan, coal town, oil and gas town. Like an 18-year-old student stood up and said, I want to know who here believes in climate change and that it's real. Every single candidate said, I do. Right. And I think people really need to, in urban centers, need to understand that. So, and it was the community here that came up with the idea of lithium from brine. It was the community here that came up with the coal to graphite, the coal to hydrogen. So reframe the question, ask what we're already bought into and what our ideas are.
Yeah, absolutely. And so often community concerns are portrayed as roadblocks or opposition when in fact it's valid concerns about what would happen to their community, potential risks, lack of benefits, those types of things. I mean, it seems to be the portrayal out there is that the community is opposing something, right?
And if they are, they're opposing, they're fighting for their survival. Like reframe it, man. Yeah.
Ricardo, I haven't brought you into the conversation. Is there anything you want to add before we're going to have to wrap up in a few minutes? Oh, I think Ricardo might be frozen. So, Abigail, is there anything else that we have?
Yeah, there's one more question in the chat. So this participant is asking about some of the evolving situation regarding Canada-US trade and the impact that it's been having on rural Canadian communities. And so they're curious if the panelists can speak to how rural communities can best manage this evolving landscape without necessarily having the same powers as the provincial and federal governments do to work around these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, Ricardo, you'd spoken a bit about some of the impacts on the trade impacts on particular communities. Maybe you could just say a couple things about some of the communities that are particularly susceptible.
Yeah, there's actually one thing. Can you hear me okay? Because my wife has been dropping, unfortunately. Okay, excellent. There's actually one thing that I wanted to rescue that I think it's pertinent to this question, which is on the side of social supports, and I'm really glad that a lot of this stuff already came out. There's a whole like category of additional programs that are not necessarily what we think of as economic development or direct just transition kind of support that are critical here. And one of the things that we saw when visiting communities where a single industry or sometimes a single firm is dominant is that when a big shock happens, they also turn out to be one of the biggest funders of social services locally. So when that company is suffering layoffs, it also might scale back from those donations, creating kind of like a double local issue in terms of both the people that need services and the services that are available. So I think there's a whole suite of support, of listening, of engaging and coordinating across federal levels that can create a more conducive baseline to these types of conversations and facilitate a quick reaction, which is what we need in certain rural places where we're seeing really big kind of impacts from sudden changes in exports.
And Tamara, you talked a little bit about BC's transition model, the supports that they provide, like for example, communities experiencing a forestry closure. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think like they'll cater it to place and to need, and I think they coordinate with the feds. So yeah, and I'm not sure the extent. I think it's a lot of labor market interventions. And then also thinking about what the future of the community could be and what that asset is and managing it. And so, yeah, they're an important convener in that. But if you look at the size of the unit, it's not that many people. And so they do what they can. I think that they've been really busy and a lot more capacity needed, but that's a good example. And then, Ricardo, I totally agree with you on social supports. I once went and in my research, I looked at all different countries that have managed different industrial transitions and looked at the instruments they used. Most were labor market workforce development policies. The use of social supports was really, really limited. So only in some interest, like for instance, the specific coal transition pensions or things like that. But we have an incredible system of employment insurance in Canada. We could be doing creative things with that potentially. I think that's a good, a good conversation to have.
Okay, we're at time, so I'm going to have to wrap things up. But I just want to thank all of you. It's been such a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could continue for a lot longer. But your insights were incredibly valuable and really helped to put the challenge of building community resilience into perspective. Thank you to those in our audience as well for coming today and contributing to the conversation. I think in the chat, Abigail's put in some links to the Community Transformations Project at the IRPP. There's data downloads, interactive maps, community profiles, policy briefs, all sorts of information. And we will have something coming up on that social question as well of how to manage major closures in communities in January. We also have some publications coming out on Monday in partnership with the Future Skills Center, looking at place-based approaches on the road to net zero. And then on December 9th, we have a webinar with the Future Skills Center as well that's going to be highlighting that work. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon. Merci encore à tous. Je vous souhaite un excellent après-midi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.